The smell of bleach. Sarah had grown accustomed to it, like everything else in this hospital. Endless rooms, identical beds, the rustle of scrubs against linoleum, and the dry voice over the intercom. Things were always happening here, but they all seemed to pass her by. She was a janitor. A woman of few words, no sudden movements, with no story anyone would care to know. Her day began before dawn. Change into the wrinkled uniform, tie her hair under a white cap, grab a bucket and mop, and silently make her way through the corridors. Then, the patient rooms. Exchange a few routine phrases with someone here and there. Listen to a complaint, remove a bedpan, change sheets, wipe away tears from a pillow as if they were never there. Everyone was used to her presence, like furniture. They'd see her and forget, smile and turn away. Sarah didn't object. Then again, she wasn't happy about it either. She simply existed here, among the white walls. She knew all the doctors by name but rarely spoke more than a couple of words to anyone, especially avoiding the department head. Dr. Morrison, a man in his 50s, with a heavy chin, a shiny forehead, and a voice that made it seem like he'd been lecturing from a podium since birth. He disliked when anyone disrupted the hierarchy. And a janitor, even if she had an opinion, should remain silent. Preferably invisible in the shadows. But Sarah knew the chief of medicine only kept him because he could speak confidently and use the right words. And if anything went wrong, he'd shift responsibility to someone else's shoulders. It had happened before, more than once. One morning, while taking out trash from the procedure room, Sarah accidentally overheard a fragment of conversation. Temperatures all over the place, unstable blood pressure, tests aren't showing anything. And the family's already causing a scene. Influential people, by the way, added another voice, this hedge fund manager isn't just a patient, he's a client, and not a cheap one. What do you think, Morrison? Until we understand the nature of the symptoms, it's too early to say, but I'm increasingly leaning toward encephalitis. Exotic. Was he abroad recently? Galas in London and Dubai. But why would that suddenly matter? Sarah froze. She'd heard the diagnosis, but based on the symptoms they described, that wasn't it. Another case came to mind. An old one. Identical in every way. Forget it, you're not here to think. You're a janitor. She continued on her way, but everything inside her was boiling. Her thoughts wouldn't leave her alone. During the morning deep clean in the room where the hedge fund manager lay, Sarah observed him from the corner of her eye. A man in his 60s, pale, sunken face, uneven breathing. He tossed restlessly in bed. Occasionally mumbling incoherent phrases. A nurse sat nearby, recording his vitals. A resident stood in the corner, staring at a monitor. His blood pressure spiked again, reported the nurse, pulse is unstable, and his pupils are uneven. Sarah tensed again. Everything inside her resisted. She knew what was happening. She recognized this condition. Many years ago, she had seen it. In another hospital, under different circumstances, a doctor with a clipboard had quietly cursed and left. Sarah remained alone with the patient. Her heartbeat drowned out the ringing in her ears. She sank onto the edge of a chair in the corner of the room. You're not a doctor, you're a janitor. Stay quiet. But this thought had no power. Not today. At lunch, she made her decision. During the break, when the attending physicians were again discussing the hedge fund manager's condition in the staff room, Sarah entered. Carefully, quietly, she approached the edge of the table. Excuse me, she said, almost in a whisper, I heard you can't determine the nature of his condition. May I say something? The doctors looked up from their papers. A pause. Then chuckles. Are you our infectious disease specialist now? Dr. Morrison raised his eyebrows, or have you just been overhearing diagnoses while hungry? Someone snickered, others simply looked away. Sarah clutched the cloth in her hand but didn't leave. I think he has a rare strain of neurotoxic meningitis. I've seen a case exactly like this before. Silence fell over the staff room. Someone sneezed, someone walked in with food and immediately walked back out. Morrison slowly stood up. Tomorrow we have a consultation. Want to show off? Come. Tell everyone what you've seen, he smirked. Well, janitor. Will you speak up? Sarah nodded and left without looking back. And that evening, standing by the window, she put on glasses for the first time in many years, sat down with an old folder of clippings, and began preparing everything she knew, everything she remembered. A battle lay ahead, but no longer for respect, for truth. Sarah barely slept that night. Before her eyes flashed pages of old medical journals, diagrams, excerpts, lectures. Somewhere in the recesses of her memory, the voices of mentors came alive, faces of patients, fragments of conversations. All of this had once been part of her life. Before one mistake, someone else's, but signed by her hand, had stripped her of the right to heal. Back then, she hadn't fought, hadn't wanted to refute, convince, she simply disappeared, retreated into the shadows and remained there. But now the shadow had shifted, and she herself had taken a step forward. The morning consultation took place in the conference room, where janitors never entered. Large, bright, with floor-to-ceiling windows, a long table and numerous chairs, it was a place where fates were decided. Of patients, doctors, sometimes medicine itself. When Sarah entered, no one even looked at her. Here's our star, someone muttered with a smirk, now we'll witness the magic of the mop and bucket. Department head Morrison paced importantly along the table, like a director before a premiere. He spoke loudly, enunciating each word, savoring the attention. Esteemed colleagues, as you know, we have an emergency case with a serious but extremely important patient. All tests are inconsistent. The symptoms are not obvious, he gestured toward the projector, where images and graphs flashed. We've put forward several hypotheses, but there's an opinion that came unexpectedly. Our respected support staff, he paused, has proposed another version. Allow me to give the floor to Sarah, the janitor. Silence, a few laughs. Someone chuckled, someone leaned back in their chair, someone even started to pull out their phone. Sarah approached the screen. The papers trembled in her hand. A voice inside prompted, turn around and leave, you don't belong in this world. But she didn't listen. In 2017, she began, I participated in the analysis of a case in Alaska. Male, 62 years old. Returning from Southeast Asia. Insomnia, anxiety, temperature spikes, constricted pupils, unsteady speech, fragmentary amnesia. She turned the page. Within a week, his condition worsened. No test identified the pathogen. But later it was confirmed, a rare neurotoxic strain of meningitis, caused by contaminated water in an unlicensed swimming pool. Sarah raised her eyes. Your patient has the same clinical presentation. Down to the exact symptoms. Tests won't show it. You need to run a specific PCR diagnostic for NVZ-17 strain markers. The room was quiet. One of the internists frowned. Another raised his eyebrows. The chief of medicine, sitting closer to the screen, thoughtfully touched his chin. Continue, he unexpectedly said. Sarah nodded and slowly moved to her conclusion. If the diagnosis is confirmed, treatment must begin immediately. A 24-hour delay could lead to irreversible consequences, up to and including death. The same professor who had been smirking in the corridor yesterday was now flipping through a printout of test results. NVZ-17, he whispered, I've heard of it. There was an outbreak in Canada. One case in China. 3 years ago. Morrison stood silently. His face had lengthened. He was no longer laughing. Are you sure? He asked quietly. 98%, Sarah replied. And at that moment, something happened that she didn't expect. We'll check, the chief of medicine intervened, urgently. Run the PCR, contact the infectious disease center. And... He paused mid-sentence. Janitor Sarah, stay afterward. I want to speak with you personally. When the consultation ended, the room emptied quickly. But the looks remained. Some regarded her with bewilderment, others with surprise. But there were no more mockery, no more disdain. For the first time in many years, Sarah felt heard. And most importantly, she hadn't been afraid to speak. Sarah sat in a small, almost empty office across from the chief of medicine. An anatomical poster hung on the wall. A carafe of water and 2 plastic cups stood in the corner. Here it smelled not of bleach, but of papers, dust, and something else. Something drier, more administrative. The chief of medicine spent a long time leafing through some papers, not looking at her. Silent. And this silence was oppressive, like before a storm. Sarah felt her palms tighten. She was neither a patient nor staff here. For now, neither a person nor a position. Finally, he set down his pen. You worked at a clinic in Portland, he asked. She nodded. Her voice seemed lost somewhere in her chest. In 2007, a young infectious disease specialist left it. Excellent credentials, but accused of negligence. A signature under an incorrect diagnosis. Patient deceased. Was that you? She flinched but nodded again. Then why didn't you contest the finding? You had the opportunity. Sarah looked away. In her head echoed the voice of that lawyer who had then insistently advised. Let it go, it will drag on for years. You don't need that. And a second voice, her husband's. You won't be able to prove anything anyway. Forget it. Start with a clean slate. I was afraid, she whispered, back then, it seemed easier to disappear than to fight. The chief of medicine nodded. He looked not like a judge, but rather like a doctor examining an old, poorly healed wound. He reached for a folder. I requested data on the current patient. The preliminary result has already come in, PCR. You were right. It's NVZ-17. Tomorrow we'll start therapy according to the protocol you suggested. Sarah lowered her gaze. So he'll survive? If we're in time, yes. He paused. Now tell me, why did you speak up? Why now? Sarah thought. The thoughts in her head swirled like snowflakes before her face. Slowly. Chaotically, but each about the past. Because I couldn't stay silent anymore, she answered quietly. I felt that if I remained silent again, I wouldn't forgive myself. The chief of medicine looked at her for a long time, then smiled. Not as an administrator, but as a person. You know, I have an idea. We're opening an infectious disease diagnostics department. Would you like to try yourself there? Formally, you'll start as a physician assistant, then retake your exams. We'll support you. Her heart stopped for a second, then began pounding as if someone had thrown open a window in a stuffy room. But, she faltered, that's impossible. I don't have clearance. We'll fix that. He stood up. Sometimes second chances come not from the system, but from a person. He left. And she sat in silence for several more minutes, not knowing how to breathe. Later, during evening rounds, one of the nurses stopped her in the corridor. You today? Well, you were cool, Sarah. I never thought you were a doctor. I hadn't thought so for a long time either, she replied with a smile. And she continued on, toward the room with the sick hedge fund manager. The light was still on there. Life continued there. She was no longer just a janitor, nor a doctor in exile. She was a person who had reclaimed her right to be heard. And perhaps for the first time in a long time, she forgave herself for it. A week passed. Room number 6, where Mr. Thompson lay, no longer resembled a sterile capsule with IVs and tubes. The window was slightly open, a vase of fruit stood on the nightstand. A business magazine beside it. The patient himself, aged, thinner, but alive, was smiling for the first time in days. Sarah entered quietly, as always. Yet he noticed her immediately. "Here's our doctor in janitor's clothing," he said, nodding respectfully. "Come in, Sarah, I've been waiting for you." She approached the bed, containing her inner tension. His gaze was not the same as when he had looked down from his position before. Now there was something else in it, something more human. "I wanted to thank you," he began, choosing his words. "They told me that you insisted on the right tests, saved me literally hours before the end." "I just did what I thought was necessary," she answered quietly. "No, you did more," he sighed. "I've spent almost a month in this hospital, seen many faces, but yours turned out to be the only one that wasn't pretending. And that's a rarity." He paused, then unexpectedly added. "Tell me, why are you here? Why aren't you in a white coat?" Sarah froze for a moment. Thoughts raced through her head. The answer was both complex and simple. "Once I made a mistake, or, rather, allowed others to decide I had made a mistake, and didn't try to prove otherwise, I just left. And now you've returned." He looked at her with interest. She smiled, genuinely this time. "I suppose so." When Thompson was discharged, rumors spread through the hospital again, but different ones. Some of the young doctors asked Sarah for the reading list she'd mentioned at the consultation. The head nurse suggested Sarah take new janitors under her wing. And then he came, the chief of medicine, with a paper in hand. "The committee has approved your recertification. Just need to pass the interview, and you're back in the system. We're ready to support you." Sarah held the form like a relic, not because of the words, but because it was her chance, not one someone gave her, but one she had reclaimed for herself. 2 months later, she stood in another conference room, in a white coat, with a badge that read, "Dr. Sarah Miller, Infectious Disease Specialist." She looked at the students doing their internships, at the young doctors listening to her lecture, at the same podium from which she had once retreated into the shadows. "Symptoms are the key," she said. "Don't be afraid to see what others miss. Don't be afraid to think independently, even if others ridicule you for it." Sometimes someone who had once mocked her still passed by in the corridor but no longer raised their eyes. And once, after such an encounter, Sarah thought, "I'm not angry. I've just let go and moved on." And on the windowsill in her office stood a pot of kalanchoe, a gift from her patient, that same hedge fund manager. The card read, "Thank you for your voice. When everyone was silent, you spoke." What do you think most often prevents people from believing in themselves again? Share in the comments and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss new stories based on real experiences.